Today's daf in Menachot Menachot is daf Yud Daled 14, and we are up to a Mishnah on the bottom of Yud Gimel Amud Bet, which is a pretty nice place to start. And so the topic that we actually started with at the end of last parak and have continued into this parak is a topic of pigol. Pigol, which somehow is the most abstract and complicated concept we deal with all the time. But the basic idea behind pigol is that when the Torah says by carbon shlomim, actually, that if you eat it on the third day, you're chayav for karet. And we learned in Zvachim and elsewhere that it doesn't actually mean if you eat the carbon on the third day, you're chayav karet. It means if you think about eating the carbon on the third day while you're doing an essential act of the carbon. So while you're doing the shchita and the kabbalah, halacha, zrika, you think, I'm going to eat this at the wrong zman, chutz lizmano, then you're chayav, then the animal's pigel, and if you end up eating that meat, you're chayav karet. Right? You don't have to wait till the third day. The meat right away is karet. So we learned the same thing about a carbon mincha, which makes sense, right? If you do the kmitza or the hak or the nitinat kli or the holacha or the putting it on the mizbeach with a thought that you're going to eat something in the wrong time or do the sacrifice put on the mizbeach in the wrong time, it's pigol. And yesterday we introduced the really complicated concept, which is that with the mincha, you have to put two things on the mizbeach. Not just the kmitza, like the blood of a carbon, but also the livona. And that got us into this discussion of what's called chatzi matir. Right? When you have an animal where there's two things, not an animal, a carbon, a matir, a carbon, sorry, where you have two things that are necessary to make the carbon kosher, right? Then if you have a machshava about one of them, how does that affect the other? And the examples we brought yesterday were two examples. One was the lechem hapanim, which is brought on the mizbeach with two bezichim, two cups of spices. What if you have a thought about one cup and the other cup and not both? And the other was the shtei kivsei atzeret. On atzeret, on Shavuot, you would bring two kvasim, two sheep. You'd also brought many other animals, but sheep were the main ones in this case. And you brought two loaves of bread. And if you did everything properly, you shechted the kvasim, the loaves of bread would go to the kohanim, right? But what if you shecht one keves wrong or one loaf you have a wrong thought? What happens then? So that's today's Mishnah, which we read yesterday. So let's read it again. Excuse me. Shachat shnei kvasim. On Shavuot, you shecht the two kivsei atzeret, and the thought you have while you're doing that is you're going to eat. Where am I? You're going to lechol. Your thought is to eat one of them in the wrong time. Lechol echad min hachalot lemachar. You say, I'm going to eat one of the loaves of bread tomorrow, which is wrong. You're supposed to eat it that day, but not the other one. Or the same thing by lechem hapanim. Miktir shnei bezichim. You are maktir on the mizbeach the two cups of spices of lechem hapanim with the thought lechol echad min hastarim lemachar. You're going to eat one of the series of loaves the next day. Rabbi Yossi says, well, it's pigol, but only the thing you thought about. Oto achala v'to seder shechishev alav pigol v'chayav alav karet. That object is pigol, and if you eat it, you're chayiv karet. But the sheni is not pigol; it's pasul ve'embo karet. Now we're going to see in the Gemara later today. Either it should be mutar, or it should be pigol. Like what's the middle ground? But Rabbi Yossi says it's pasul, and there's no karet for eating it. And the Chachamim say no, it's a carbon, and the carbon has 12 loaves on Shabbos or 2 loaves on Shavuot. If you have pigol in one, it's pigol in the whole karban. Zev is at pigol v'chayavin alav karet. If you eat any of the part of that lechem apanim or shnei lechem of atzeret. Now says the Gemara, Rav Huna, 7 lines on the bottom. Says Rav Huna, sorry, here we are. Says Rav Huna, Omer Hayir Rabbi Yossi. Now, I could take Rabbi Yossi even further. Let's say a person had a thought when they were shechting is a hard thing, but when they were doing zorik, when they were zrika of an animal, that they're going to eat, remember, pigol can be in eating the karban in the wrong time or bringing it on the mizbeach in the wrong time. And your thought was, I'm going to eat yerech shayamin, the right leg, the right thigh of this animal in 2 days. Says Rav Yossi, says Rav Huna in the name of, in the opinion of Rav Yossi, pigol b'yerech shayamin. If you have pigol thought about the right thigh of an animal, lo nitpagel yerech shel small. You don't make pigol on the other part of the animal. Meaning pigol is very sensitive to the part, just like with the 2 loaves of bread. Pigol in one loaf is not in the other loaf. Pigol in one leg of the animal doesn't make the other leg pigol. And if you eat the other leg, you're not chayv karet. My timer, what's the reason that Rafuna says this? Ibaitema svara, it might be logical. Ibaitema kra might be based on a pasuk. What's the those sources? Ibaitema svara, it might just be a thought, like an idea, a logical idea. Where am I? Um, it's 6 lines on the bottom. Because lo adifa machshava mimaseh tuma. A thought about something shouldn't be more than a physical act. Think about it. Let's say after a carbon is shechted and cut up, you go over and you're mitame one leg of that carbon. So then all of a sudden get a big alarm in the Azara. Wait, careful, don't eat this leg of the carbon. But the rest of the carbon you can eat, right? The fact that it was one carbon, now it's separate. So you don't like keep an identity like like for twins, you injure one, you injure the other. If you're mitame one aver, right? You don't itzma chad aver mi itzma lekuloi. The whole animal doesn't become tame. Therefore, you don't think of a carbon as an entity. You think of it as parts. And so if you're mitame one part, then the other part's not tame. And if you pigol on one part, the other part's not pigol. Ibaite makar, or else it's based on a pasuk, which is that pasuk says hanefesh ha'ochelet mimenu. Excuse me, a person who eats from it, referring to this carbon shlamim on the third day, avonat tisa. But what does the word mimenu? Why don't you say nefesh ha'ochelet? Mimenu means it velo mechavero. That it's it, that specific part of an animal that you thought about pigol, not the rest of the animal. And so, of course, if you thought I'm going to eat all of it in 2 days, the whole animal's pigol. But if you think I'm going to eat this part in 2 days, only that part is pigol, not the rest. That's Rav Huna's statement in the name of Rabbi Yossi, which is a shockingly bizarre statement. And actually, just to give you an update, in around 25 minutes, we're going to walk it back. So
I was going to say the idea that intent isn't that serious. Intent for idol worshiping is that puzzles anything.
well, not necessarily. I mean, not if it's separate parts. Not like let's say you shecht an animal, right? What not idol worship, and you come and sit down at your kitchen table and say this leg is for avodah zarah. It doesn't make the rest of the animal usser, right? It's already cut up.
Mhm.
So I think obviously often you just do it generally, like this animal is for avodah zarah, this animal is for pigul. But what Rafun
Mhm.
is pointing out is that if you're very specific and based on our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah talked about 2 loaves of bread. A thought about one doesn't possible the other. So he said it even further. A thought about one part of the animal doesn't possible the rest. Now again, in around 20 minutes we're going to walk this back, but this is what Rafun
Okay,
believes. Okay.
I'll wait.
Ask Rav Nachman to Rav Huna. Eitvei Rav Nachman to Rav Huna. Ask Rav Nachman to Rav Huna with your great chiddush. We're now 3 lines from the bottom. What about our Mishnah, right? What does our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah says, Lo'olam ein bo karet. You never, well, actually, this is not our Mishnah. This is a Braita, sorry. Lo'olam, you never have, that's why I take the word v'chachamim omrim. That's the confusing part. So take it out because it's not our Mishnah. But there's a Braita that says the following. La'olam, you never, and I'll see what this word la'olam means in a minute, but you never are chayiv karet, aji yifagel b'shtehen b'kizayit. You have to have pigol in both of them. Now shtehen we think means shtehen. We think right now. We'll see this in a second. That it's referring to the Tnei Kivsei Atzeret, right? The two kvasim of the Atzeret, and in those kvasim, of course, there are 2 loaves of bread. So we think right now we're talking about the loaves of bread, right? Because it's lashon nekeva, like bread. So b'shtehen b'kazayit, meaning you have to think when you're doing the shchita of the Kivsei Atzeret that I want to do pigol in each of the loaves of the kazayit, not one or the other, but each of them. Now, what this implies is b'shtehem in. If you think about both loaves, it's pigol, but if you think about only one, it's not pigol. Now, money. Who is the author of this Braita? Which, again, if you take out the word chachamim, we don't know who the author is. So, ilema Rabbanan, if you say it's the Rabbanan, clearly it's not the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan said very obvious, very frontwardly in our Mishnah that a thought about one loaf makes the whole thing pigol. If you shech the kivsei atzeret in the thought of eating one loaf the wrong time, both loaves are then pigol. Elapshita Rabbi Yossi. So it's clearly Rabbi Yossi. So if you say that Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that basically because these two things are one object, right? That meaning an animal, the leg of an animal, the other leg of an animal is one thing. Mishum hachi itztaref. Now I understand why, if you're thinking about pigol of kazai. Now we think right now means that you have to have a kazait from the two of them, meaning you think when I'm shechting the animal, I'm going to eat half a kazait from one loaf tomorrow, half a kazait from another loaf tomorrow, and together it is a kazait and it's pigol. So I understand then why it combines. Elai Amr Tre Gufininu, if you say top of your Dalet and Aleph. If you say that in fact different parts of an animal are different, then different loaves are certainly different as well. And so then why would half a zayit on one loaf combine with half a zayit on the other loaf? It would be like saying I have half a zayit of pigul of one leg and half a zayit of pigul of the other leg, right? Which according to what you interpret in Rabbi Yossi, they don't combine. So if different objects, in this case it's two loaves of bread, don't combine, then for sure different, then how why would it be pigul? Answers the Gemara, well, the answer is following Hamani. This is actually a third Tana. It's Rebbe. There's a third Tana, right? Rebbe often comes as a third Tana because he's later and, has his own opinion, that this is opinion of Rebbe, which basically is some middle ground between the Chachamim, who say, on one hand, that a thought about one loaf passes the whole carbon and it's all pigul. Rabbi Yossi, who says a thought about one doesn't affect the other at all, right? And Rebbe, who says, well, you could combine them. And where's Rebbe? Rebbe hidetanya shochiret keves. This is another Braita. The Braita says if you shecht the keves, right? And again, this is the keves of Atzeret. So you shecht one of the lambs of the kivsei Atzeret, and your thought when you're doing that, we are at the second line of Yudal and Aleph, and your thought is le'achol chatzi zayit michalazu. Your thought is, well, I'm shechting lamb A because I'm going to eat half of kazayit of the loaf that's next to that lamb tomorrow. The chen chavero, and then you shech the second keves, and your thought is, I'm going to eat half a kazayit of that one tomorrow. The chol chatzi zayit michalazu. Rebbe says, you know what? Omer ani shezeh kasher. I think this is kosher. Now, why is this kosher? Because you didn't have intention when you were doing it to combine them, right? You very clearly said, I want half on this one and half on that one. So Taima, says the Gemara, Damar chatzi chatzi. The reason is because you very distinctly said, I want half of one and half of the other. Aval Amar kizayit mishtehem mitzdaref. Had you said what we said in the earlier Braita, you said basically, I'm shechting these kfasim, I'm going to eat a kizayit from the two loaves tomorrow, so half of each, but I didn't separate them, you would be chayav because you can combine those two things together. And so this opinion now is the opinion of Rebbe, who basically says that you don't automatically combine them, but if you intentionally combine them, they come together. Says, well, that's a nice answer, but who's Rebbe going according to? Meaning, Rebbe has to have an opinion about the earlier machloket in our Mishnah of Rabbi Yossi and Chachamim, right? Remember, the question in our Mishnah was, you shecht the kivsei atzeret with the thought that loaf A you're going to eat tomorrow, right? So the Rebbe Yossi said loaf A is pigul and loaf B is not pigul, and the Chachamim said the whole carbon is pigul, both loaves, right? So Rebbe aliba deman, who is Rebbe, the later Tana, going according to in the argument in our Mishnah? If he goes according to the Rabbanan, why do you need to say both? You don't need to have a kizayit from both loaves. One loaf would be enough. If you have a kizayit from one loaf, the whole carbon's pigul, and both loaves are pigul. If it's going to Rabbi Yossi, then 100 kushin l'duchten. Then the question goes back to the beginning of the question, which is that Rav Huna explained Rabbi Yossi as saying that because they're separate parts, the right leg and the left leg are separate, they don't combine, right? Thoughts about one don't combine with the other. The same thing would be true about two loaves. Half a loaf and half a loaf is not one full loaf because they're separate things. Answers the Gemara, la'olam aliba d'Rabbanan. The truth is that you made a whole mistake when we read this bright, and I pointed this out earlier, but this is very important. We thought that the question was that about the loaves. But the truth is that the question here is about the animals. And this gets to, remember, one of the very complicated parts of pigul is that there's the thing that you're doing the pigul act in has to be one of the matirim or one of the essential parts of the karban, like shchita or pouring the blood or kamitza or things like that. The object of the pigul is eating it tomorrow or sprinkling the blood or something like that. So there's difference. It's not the shchita. There are acts of pigul and the object of pigul. And we actually here, we're talking not about the act of pigul, I'm sorry, not about the object, but about the act. And so instead of reading the words, lo temachi yifagel bishtehen, right, shtehem, which is lashon nikeva, and therefore would be referring to the lechem, ela ema achi yifagel bishnehem. Take out the word, the tough, and put a nun in, right? This is why it's good we paid attention in grammar, right? It has to be them, masculine, meaning referring to the animals. And so the point here is totally a different point. The point is not what the loaves are. The point is what the animals are. Meaning when you did the shechita of the animal, says the Braita, you have to have thoughts of pigol, not just in one of them, but any of them. Afilu ba'achat mehem. So even if you shecht one of the lambs of Atzeret and thinking while you're doing it, I'm going to eat the bread tomorrow, right? That's pigol. And what's the chiddush there? It's the fukim midir Rabbi Meir. It excludes the opinion of Rabbi Meir, which we quoted yesterday, and we're going to have in a couple days. Damar mifaglin b'chatzi matir, right? Rabbi Meir says sorry, the opposite. I said one is okay, but one is not okay, right? So that if you shecht one of the kvasim and your thought is, I'm going to eat the loaves tomorrow, that's not pigol because that is only half of the matir. You only had a thought of pigol when you're doing half the shechita, not half the shechita, but shechita of one of the two animals. And that is, according to the opinion of Rebbe and this Braita, is that you're not chayav pigol unless you think about both of it while you're doing it both animals. And that goes against Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is going to say later, mifaglin b'chatzi matir. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that in fact you can have pigol when you do half of a matir, right? So when you do part of a korban. Kamash malan delo. So the Bright is coming to tell you that no, the whole point here is that you have to have thoughts about pigol while you're doing both shchita or both zrika of the animals. So that is the whole explanation of the Braita. Says Gemara, well, that's a great explanation, but it doesn't hold up water. Because ihachi, if that's the explanation, we are around the third of the way down, maybe 12 lines down. Why la'olam? What is the word la'olam? Remember, the Braita said, if you go back to the Braita, that you are, I'm going to read it. The Braita said, la'olam ein bo karet, the third to bottom line of Yud Gimel Amud Bet. You're forever, la'olam meaning always, you're not chayiv karet, until you had pigol of both of them, which we're now reading b'shneihen b'kizayit. But what's the word le'olam? Le'olam means in all cases. So if you read the Braita very expansively, that's referring to both them and then them, meaning male and female, meaning both the animals and the loaves. Right? Animals are shneihem, loaves are shtehen. Then, and it's Rabbi Yossi, then you learn a lot from this Braita. Because la'afuki midura meir umidura banangati. There's then he's basically saying two principles. One is that you have to think about both animals, and you have to think about both loaves, right? And it's telling you that it's not like Rabbi Meir, and it's not like the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan say if you think about one loaf, all the loaves become pigol. Rabbi Meir says if you do it while you're doing the act of one karban, one animal, all the loaves become pigol. He's saying now in the Braita that Rabbi Yossi disagrees with both points. If the whole point of this Braita is that it's the Rabbanan, that you have to think about one loaf and you can possibly the other loaf, and the whole point is Lafukim and Rabbi Meir, my La'olam. The word La'olam seems to be extra. So this seems to be a problem with the Braita. So that's problem number one. Says Martin, there's another problem. And we again, the Ode. But you got another issue with this concept. And again, the issue we're having a concept with is Rav Huna's opinion, which I'm going to walk a step back because it's very confusing and complex, is that our Mishnah said, a machloket Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim, which is that if a person shechs the kvasim of Atzeret, which have two loaves associated with them, and their thought at the time of the shechita was, I'm going to eat one loaf in the wrong time, right? Said Reb Chachamim, that's pigol. You had a machshava of chutz lizmano, the whole carbon's pigol. If you eat those loaves, you're chayiv karet, any of them. And Rabbi Yossi said you only are chayiv pigol in the loaf that you had a thought about. So if you thought about loaf A, eating loaf A is pigol and is chayiv karet, loaf B is not chayiv karet. Rav Huna came and extended that and said that's not just true about two loaves, it's true even about one animal. That if you have a thought in one animal, I'm going to eat the right thigh tomorrow, then that right thigh becomes pigol, but the rest of the animal is not pigol, right? So that was Rav Huna's chiddush. So we just had a problem with it from the Shtei Alechem. Says the Gemara, now we got another problem. A further problem is Ha'amar Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi came and quoted a Braita. Now, the reason this is a problem is that it's a Braita. Tashma, come and learn from the following Braita. Rabbi Omer Mishum Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yudah Nasi, right, says, Zatana, says the name of Rabbi Yossi, who of course is the author of this opinion, Pigol b'davar naseh b'chutz pigel. This is another aspect of pigol, which is very, very interesting, which is that, remember that there are certain carbonot we learned about in Tzvachim that are done inside the Kodesh. That's what here chutz and pnim means. Chutz means in the Azara, the regular outside of the tent, right, in the open space, and pnim means inside the Kodesh, not a tent, but the building, right? Remember that you had certain animals that are done like parim and siirim and naseh bifnim, right? So remember with those animals, generally the process, and again, I don't want to oversimplify because it's a whole Masechet Zvachim, is that you would shech them outside in the Azara. You would take the blood and sprinkle it on the Mizbeach inside, right? You would then sprinkle it 7 times, put it on the Mizbeach. You would then take it outside and burn it on the Mizbeach outside, right? Remember, those are, and then you didn't eat them usually, but right, you would burn on the Mizbeach outside. We have a halacha, which we learned about in Zvachim, which we're going to repeat here, which is that you have to have a machshava in the place where you're doing the act. Meaning, if you think while you're doing the shechita outside, I'm going to put the blood inside tomorrow, that's not pigel, because since it's an inside thing, an outside thought doesn't apply to it. So let's read that inside. So says the Braita, pigel b'davar naseh b'chutz. If you have a machshava of pigel in something that's done outside while you're outside, pigel. But if you have a machshava about a davar naseh b'fnim, lo pigel. If you have a machshava of something that's done inside, it doesn't make an act outside doesn't make it pigel. Ketzad, let's spell that out for you. What's the example? This again, this is the Braita speaking. What's an example of this? Let's say Hayomed b'chutz, right? Person standing, a Kohen standing outside in the Azara of the Beit Hamikdash. And he says, Hareini shochet, I'm going to shech this animal, al menat lahazot midamo lemachar. I'm going to sprinkle the blood tomorrow. That's lo pigel. That's not pigel because the sprinkling of the blood is done inside the Beit Hamikdash in the Kodesh, and machshava b'chutz b'davar naseh b'fnim. That's a machshava outside about something done inside. But if you're and if you're omed bifnim and vice versa, if you're standing inside when you get up to the step of sprinkling the blood, and you say Arenu mazel, I'm going to sprinkle the blood now, al minat on condition that tomorrow I'm going to burn the rest of it outside. I'm going to pour out the blood outside tomorrow. Lo pigel. That's not pigel because machshava bifnim b'davar naseh b'chutz, because you're thinking while you're inside about something that's being done outside. Again, this is not yet relevant for us. Continues, Haya omeid b'chutz, but if you're standing outside and Omer and you say, Hareinu shochet al manat l'shpoch shirayim l'machar l'kterim merav l'machar, I'm shechting this karban now, but I'm not going to do it properly. I'm going to spill it out. I'm going to burn it tomorrow. That's pigel because it's tomorrow, so it's b'chutz l'zmano, and it's a machshava b'chutz b'davar nasa b'chutz. You're thinking outside about something that is done outside. Okay, so that is the Braita. Now, the problem with this Braita, according to Rav Huna, is that the Braita said, I'm going to spill out the shirayim, l'shpoch shirayim, right? So your thought is the following: I'm shechting this animal, and I'm doing this on condition that tomorrow I'm going to spill out the leftover blood. Says the Braita, according to Rabbi Yossi, that's pigel. Now, what is pigel, right? Meaning the carbon's pigel, and if you eat it, you're chayiv karet. Eat what, right? Ilay malif gulei dam. If you eat the blood becomes. Remember, you're not allowed to eat blood, of course, in the Torah, but this would add a second prohibition of eating blood of karet because it's pigol. But says the Gemara, this is a whole other detail which we learned in Zvachim, which is that blood can never be the subject of pigol. Dam mimifagel. Dam itself does not become pigol. Ditznan, because we learned in the Mishnah in Zvachim, Eila dvarim shein chayavin aleim mishum pigol. The following objects don't become pigol, meaning all the things that are done to be matir or carbon. The komets of a mincha, the lavona of a mincha, the ketoret of the Ketoret that are brought, Minchat Kohanim, the Mincha of the Kohen. Again, we're going to detail all these in a little bit. Minchat Nisachim, Minchat Kohen Mashiach. Again, these are all things that are brought completely on the Mizbeach, and therefore there's no leftover that's supposed to be eaten by people, and therefore they don't become pigol themselves, meaning the animal becomes pigol, but them themselves are not pigol, and vehadam, and the Mishnah said blood. So you can't say it's referring to blood. Ella Pshita, it must be that it's referring to the meat, le'afgule basar. And what we're basically saying is that if you shecht an animal, and your idea when you shecht this animal is, I'm going to do everything properly, except tomorrow I'm going to leave over the blood and pour the blood down the drain tomorrow, right? Says the Gemara, that says the Braita, that's pigol. Now what's pigol? The meat is pigol. But of course, you just said, according to Rav Huna said in the name of Rav Yossi, that pigol about one object, about one leg of an animal, doesn't make the other leg pigol. And here you're telling me that thinking when I'm going to pour the blood tomorrow makes the animal pigol. How could that be? Right? If pigol has to be about the object, then thinking I'm going to pour the blood now is the thing, how could that make the meat of the animal pigol? It must be hashna. Let's read that inside. Ma hatam. There, right, in the case of the karban bifnim. You didn't have a thought about the meat at all. Your thought was, I'm going to pour the blood out tomorrow. So your thought of pigol was about the blood. And Amar Rabbi Yossi mifagel. Rabbi Yossi says it makes the meat pigel. Hacha, here where you think the chashabe bezebach gufe, your thought is I'm going to make the right leg pigel. Look, kol shekain the pigel b'yerech yamin, pigel b'yerech small. Shouldn't it for sure apply to the rest of the animal? So you see very clearly from this Braita, and this is really a great proof, that pigel does not apply just to the thing you're thinking about. Pigel applies to the carbon. And just like Rav Yossi clearly says that if you have a thought of pigel about pouring out the shirayim, which is a blood object, it makes the carbon pigel, and we said it can't mean the blood becomes pigel because blood never becomes pigel. It means the meat becomes pigel. So too, if you have pigel about one leg, it's going to make the other leg pigel. So this is a second proof. The ode, and while we're doing it, let's pile on a third proof. Where are we up to? Um, how many lines to the bottom? Around 10 lines to the bottom. The third question is, Amar Ravina, Ravina quoted another Braita, Tashma, Kometz et mincha, right? This is actually our Mishnah that we had yesterday. Yesterday. If you make a kmitza of the mincha, this was the beginning of our parak, le'achol shiara, with the intention to eat the leftovers, right? The shiraim of the flour, which is what you're supposed to eat, or lahaktir kumsa, or to be the haktara of the kometz limachar, on the next day. Modeh Rabbi Yossi b'zeh she'yifagav v'chayim lev karet. Rabbi Yossi admits that this is pigel and you're chayiv karet. This was our Mishnah yesterday. Now, I don't get it. When you say lahaktir kumsa, Rabbi Yossi admits that if you have a thought when you're doing the kmitza that you're going to sacrifice, you're going to burn the komets on the mizbeach tomorrow, it becomes pigel. What does it become pigel? Meaning it, the kmitza becomes pigel. Afgule mai. What becomes pigel? Ilema lafgule komets, that the komets becomes pigel. We just quoted the Mishnah. Komets min mefagel. Does the komets ever become pigel? Vatsnana. We just quoted the Mishnah. El dvarim shein chayav leim mishum pigel. And the first one was the komets. Right? A kometz is not pigel because a kometz is burned entirely on the mizbeach, and it's the matir. Elapshita means that if you're doing the kmitza of the mincha and you say, I'm going to sacrifice this kmitza tomorrow. Rabbi Yossi admits that the mincha becomes pigel, meaning the shirayim, the leftover flour becomes pigel. Elapshita lefgule shirayim, and so the same exact question. How could an act on the kometz make the shirayim pigel if you say an act on the right leg doesn't even make the left leg pigel? So hashtamat, just like over there by the komets, the chashav baby shiraim gufe, you didn't have any thought about the shiraim. Your thought was only about the kmitza. Turn the page mifgali, but the shiraim still became pigel. Hacha the chashav baby zvicha gufa lo kol shekain. Here, where your thought is about the zvicha itself, meaning you thought about the right leg, for sure the left leg becomes pigel, and therefore Rabbi Huna is wrong. And in fact, although Rav Yossi said in our Mishnah that if you have a machshava about one loaf, it doesn't make the other loaf pigol, that's not because pigol is limited to what you think about. Clearly, you can have pigol thoughts about one object in a carbon and make the rest of the carbon pigol. So if you have a thought about one leg, it'll make the rest of the other legs of the animal pigol also. So what is the reason for Rav Yossi in the Mishnah that a thought about one loaf of the shtei alechem doesn't make pigol the second loaf? Says Rabbi Yochanan, Elamar Rabbi Yochanan, Hainu time under Rabbi Yossi. We're at the second line. This is the reason for Rabbi Yossi. It's a gzerata katuv by the shtei alechem. It has no application to other karbanot. Hakatuv asan guf echad. The Torah describes the two chalot of Shavuot as one object at sometimes, and sometimes hakatuv asan shnei gufim. And sometimes the Torah describes them as two objects. So why is that? Guf echad hamakvi adadi. They're one object that they are ma'akev each other, meaning you have to have one in order to have the other. If you bring one without the other, you didn't fulfill half a mitzvah or any mitzvah. It's one mitzvah of two loaves. But shnei gufim, but it is two objects to tell you that each one should be done separately. Now, this is a separate halacha, which is that when you make the loaves, remember these are big loaves on Atzeret, you don't make one huge thing of dough and then split it into two. You take flour and water and oil and you make one loaf, and you take flour and water and oil and make another loaf. So each one's done individually. However, arvinu, if you then mix them up together, right, and arvinu means you had a thought about, I'm going to eat half of kazayit of one and half of kazayit of the other, mit arvin. Then they are combined, da katuv asan guf echad. And therefore, the Torah describes them as one thing. So if you say, I'm shechting the animal to eat half a kazayit of one loaf and half a kazayit of the other loaf, that would combine. But palginu, but if you separate them, they also become separate. Mifalgi, dakatav asan shnei gufim. right? Because the Torah made them into two things, and therefore, if you had a thought, according to Rabbi Yossi, that I'm going to only do pigul about one loaf of the shtei alechem, only that loaf becomes pigul and not the rest of the shtei alechem. And so this halacha of Rabbi Yossi is not relevant to one leg of an animal, to the other leg, or to other aspects. It's a very specific halacha of the shtei lechem of Atzeret, where the Torah went out of its way to say they are both one unit and they are individual objects. And that is the case. Now, as to the Gemara, we are now 7 lines from the top. There's other karbanot that might be similar in my mind to the shtei lechem, to the shtei alechem of Atzeret. And those are two other examples where you would brought a karban mincha, but it wasn't one type of bread or one type of karban. And there's two examples of that. The first is lachmei toda. We're going to get into, as we go through the Masechta, all the details, but I'll just give you a hint that when you bring the toda is an animal that you bring for Thanksgiving, and you bring with the toda 40 loaves of bread, but they're very different. Some are flour, some are rikikim, some are, what are rikikim, like matzah, some are chametz, actually, with the toda, right? Unlike every other karban, right? And so there's different types of bread. So maybe, we're going to ask in a second, if you have a thought about one type of bread, does it apply to the other type, or is it like the atzeret, where there's one loaf doesn't apply to the other, according to Rabbi Yossi? The other example is that there's a mincha called minchat ma'afei tanur, right? A mincha that you put into an oven. And we're going to see later, there's an opinion, I think it's Rameir's opinion, that it's Reb Shimon's opinion, that when you make a minchat ma'afei tanur, it's made out of two different types. You make 5 loaves of flatbread and 5 loaves of lafa, kind of soft bread. So we'll see that there's different types of bread. And the question we're asking now is, by Rabbi Yochanan, ask Rabbi Yochanan, in these examples where there's different types of bread brought with the mincha, if you have a pigel in one type, does it make it pigel in the other type, according to Rabbi Yossi? Pigel b'lachmei toda, if you have pigel about some of the loaves of lachmei toda, mahu, what's the halacha of the other ones? Or if you have pigel b'minchat ma'afei, the minchat ma'afei, I call it ma'afei tanur, we usually call it, is it pigel in the rest of it, mahu? Tanale Rav Tachlifa Mimarava. Now Rav Tachlifa showed up from Marava. He showed up from Israel one day, and he said, I have a Breita, which answers that. And the Breita says exactly what you would have thought. That now it's quote, V'chein ata omer, just like Rabbi Yossi argues by the Kivsei Atzeret, he would also argue by Lachmei Toda, V'chein ata omer b'minchat ma'afei. And so basically, Rabbi Yossi would argue in those cases and say, since there's different types of bread, there are different levels of pigul, and if you have machshava in one type of bread, it doesn't automatically make it pigul in the other types of bread. Again, that's Rabbi Yossi's opinion. The Chachamim, of course, would argue, because they hold even by the Shnei Kivsei Atzeret, the 2 loaves of bread, one makes the other one pigul. Okay, great. So we got that hopefully all clear, and everyone's going to remember it. It says the Braita. Let's take this to the next step. Tanu Rabbanan. We are around 10 lines from the top of Daf Yud Daled Amud Bet. Says the Braita. Let me give you an example of, as we're talking about pigul. Let's say b'shat shchita. Remember, you can do pigul during shchita, but while you're doing shchita of any carbon, your thought is chishev lechol chatzi zayit. Your thought is, I'm going to eat half a zayit of his karban in the wrong time. Now that's not pigul, because half a zayit means nothing. But you then keep going. Ubishat zrika, during zrika of the same carbon, chishev lechol chatzi zayit. You think I'm going to eat a half a zayit outside the right time. Pigul, that says the Braita, that animal is then pigul, and if you eat the meat, you're chayiv karet. Nipnei sheshchita uzrika mitztarfin. Because you combine shchita and zrika, because, now we're not sure exactly why, but let's just assume that because they're both essential parts of the animal, right? In order for an animal to become edible, basically, you have to do shchita, you have to do, not edible, properly done, you have to do shchita, you have to do zrika, and therefore they are mitztarif. So that's what the Braita says. Now, Ikad some read this Braita and said, well, it's shchita v'zrika de tirvayu matirim. Shchita and zrika are both things that are matir an animal, right? Meaning they are essentially the essential parts of the animal. And so those combined, tirvayu matir and in, but Kabbalah v'holacha lo. Since Kabbalah and holacha, although they are essential, this is where it's a little bit subtle, although they are essential, but since they're not considered to be matirim, right? They're not considered to be either the beginning or the end of a karban. They are not considered the same level of kedusha, the same level of fulfillment, and they don't combine. That was one opinion. And Ikad Amri, some said, no, no, no. They all combine because Hanach to Merchakim, the point of the bright is that even though Shchita's in the beginning and Zrika's at the end, they can combine. Koshkin Hanin to Mekarvin, certainly the other acts of a karban, of accepting the blood and walking with it, combine because they are closer in time to the Shchita and the Zrika. So that is the two ways to read the Breita. Now, we don't resolve that, but that's the two ways to read the Breita. Ask the Gemara, though, going backwards, is it true? Aini, is it really true that you can combine a thought with the Shchita, with a thought with the Zrika? Vatani Levi, but Levi specifically taught a Breita that said, Arba avodot ein mitzarfin lepigol. The four actions do not combine for pigol, right? We're in the first wide line. And what are the four actions, to remind you, in case you forgot them? Shchita, Zrika, Kabbalah, V'holacha. That's a weird order to put them in, but that's the order of the Breita. So clearly the Breita says they don't combine. Amar Rava, you're right. The Breita says they don't combine. There's a machloket, Tanaim. Lokashia, Harebi, Harabanan. It's a machloket between Rebbe and the Rabbanan. Who is this Rebbe and the Rabbanan? We haven't met them yet, but now we're about to meet them. The Tanya says the Gemara, as the Breita speaks out, or the second wide line, Hashochet et keves, right? Let's say you shecht a keves of atzeret. Again, we're going back to Shnei Kivsei Atzeret, and you shecht animal one, sheep number one, with the intention le'echol chatzi zayit michalazu, and you say, I'm going to eat half a zayit of this challah tomorrow, and then you shecht the second one and think, I'm going to eat half a zayit of this challah tomorrow. Right? Rebbe Omer Nish, is that kasher? Rebbe says, no problem. That's no problem. You didn't have pigol on the first one. You didn't have pigol on the second one. There's no pigol. It's kosher, actually. You can do fine. Right? And the Chachamim would say, oh, no, you combine the two loaves. So that's the same idea. According to the Chachamim, you combine two actions. According to Rebbe, you don't combine two actions. Amalei Abai said Abai, that's a very superficial combination. Because Aimer Deshamalei the Rebbe is not saying you don't combine two actions. Rebbe's saying you don't combine an action in one animal with an action in another animal, right? Aimer Deshamalei the Rebbe, all we heard from Rebbe was Chatzi Matir v'Chatzi Achila, right? You don't combine one matir, meaning one animal of the Shnei Kivsei Atzeret, and half an eating, with a second matir, half a matir, and half an eating, right? Half an animal, half a loaf, half an animal, half a loaf. But what if it was one animal and you had half a thought in the shchita and half a thought in the zrika? What if it's kulo matir, right, meaning one animal, and chatzi achila, right, half the eating in one part and half the eating in the other part? Mishamalei, you didn't hear from Rebbe that that is not pigel. So how do you know that Rebbe would argue in the case where you had a machshava to eat half of a kazayit with the shchita and half a kazayit with the zrika? Amrle Rava bar Rav Chanan Abaya, said Rava to Rav Chanan to Abaya, I'll tell you why. Because itle the Rebbe, kulo matir v'chatzi achila, if Rebbe was of the opinion that when you had one animal and you had half a thought in the shchita and half a thought in the zrika, it's pigol, right? Like, which is what the Chachamim said, then he would have made a gezerah in the case where you have two animals. Ligzar chatzi matir, v'chatzi achila, atu kula matir, v'chatzi achila. Right? So remember, there's three steps here, basically. The obvious step is that you have one action and you think, I'm going to eat a kazayit tomorrow. That's pigel. Everyone agrees. Then you had a case where you had a thought with one animal. I'm going to eat half of kazayit during when you did the shchita, and half of kazayit when you did the zrika. So two thoughts. And the Chachamim said that combines. We're saying, according to Rebbe, it doesn't combine, right? And then we proved it from a Breita where Rebbe was talking about two animals, the Shnei Kivsei Atzeret. And during one animal, you thought, I'm going to eat half. And during the other animal, you thought, I'm going to eat half. That those do not combine. So we asked, how can you prove that? And we're answering because if Rebbe agreed with the Chachamim that when you have thoughts of half a kazayit in one animal, it's pigol, then when you have thoughts of half a kazayit with two animals, sure, it's not pigol, but at least you would say it's puzzle, right? Don't eat it. Don't have the carbon, because you would make a gzera of chatzi mater v'chatzi achila atu kula mater v'chatzi achila. And what's the precedent for that? The precedent for that is our Mishnah of yesterday and today. The Rabbi Yossi gazar v'Rabbanan gazri. Both Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan made that kind of gezerah. What's just reminding you, in case you forgot the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi Gazar Ditznan, as we learned in our original Mishnah, right? Remember, according to Rabbi Yossi, if you have a thought about the levona when you're doing the kmitza, that doesn't make it pigel, right? Because remember, the thought about the flour doesn't combine with the thought about the spices, right? But Rabbi Yossi said in the Mishnah that if you aktir levona machar, if you do the kmitza with the thought of doing the levona tomorrow, Rabbi Yossi omer pasul ve'ein bo karet. Rabbi Yossi said it's pasul. You're not chayav karet. Chachamim omrim pigo v'chayim lav karet. Now, according to Rabbi Yossi, why is it pasul? Right? According to Rabbi Yossi, we asked this question in the Mishnah. Right? The Chachamim say it's pigel because you could think about the kmitza, you could think about the levona when you're doing the kmitza. But according to Rabbi Yossi, that you don't apply one to the other, why is it even pasul? Right? So clearly, because he makes a gzera. And Rabbanan Nami Gazri, Rabbanan also are gozer, because it's not pigel bekometz v'lo belevona, right? This is a Mishnah we're going to have later, right? Where you have pigel when you're doing the kometz, but not the levona, or belevona v'lo bekometz, meaning you have a thought about pigel about one of the matirim of a mincha, either the kamitza or the levona, not both. Reb Meir Omer pigol v'chayavin alav karet, because remember that's Reb Meir's opinion that you can make pigol in chatzi matir. You can make pigol in either the levona or the kmitza, but the chachamim say it's not pigol, but they don't say it's mutter. They say chachamim omrim ein bo karet ad sheyifagel b'chol matir. There's no karet, but clearly it's aser. So you see that in a case which is adjacent to pigol, someone would be gozer. And so if Rabbi Yehuda Nasi held that two halves of one animal are pigol, then he would have been gozer by two halves of two animals. So that is the proof that he doesn't. Amralei said back to him, that's a very nice, the Rava said back to Rav Chanan, sorry, that's a very nice idea, but it's not the same example. Because remember, the reason Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim are gozer is not because it's adjacent to pigel. It's because there are circumstances where it would be pigel, right? And what are those circumstances? Hachiyashta, Bishma Hatam Gaz Rabbi Yossi, Kometz de Levona, Atu Kometz de Mincha. Rabbi Yossi is gozer the kometz of levona because of the kometz of the mincha. Meaning, if according to Rabbi Yossi, if you did a kamitza of the levona with a thought that you're going to put it on the mizbeach tomorrow, it would be pigel, right? Because levona to levona would be pigel. So therefore, he said, well, person's going to make a mistake and think that since he did the kamitza of the flour wasn't pigel, a kamitza of levona won't be pigel. That's why he had to make a gezerah. And the Rabbanan Nami, the Rabbanan were Gazri, Kometz atu Kometz Minchat Chotei, right? Remember, the Rabbanan say that if you only do a machshava pigol of half of a matir, right? Remember, with most Menachot, the matir is the kamitza of the flour and the levona, right? So one and not the other is not pigol. But why did the Rabbanan make a gzera that at least, even though it's not pigol, you shouldn't eat it? They made a gzera because some Menachot don't have both of those things. Right? Remember, for example, minchat chotei only has flour, doesn't have spices, and a levona of the lechem apanim, there's no flour. Remember, lechem apanim, you don't put any of the bread on the mizbeach, you don't put any of the dough on the mizbeach, you just put the spices on the mizbeach. So since there are cases which don't have both flour and spices, you have to make a gzera, right? Levona atu levona ba bezichim of the lechem apanim. But therefore, here there's no gzera to be made, and kvasim nami. Right? Here too, keves atu keves chaveiro. Right? Here too, you can make a gzera about one of the kvasim of atzeret, right? Based on the second keves. And bazach nam atu bazach chaveiro. And one bezichim of the lechem apanim because of the other one. Right? So meaning in all those cases, I understand why you make a gzera. Elahacha, but here, there's never a case. Why would Rabbi Yehuda Nasi make a gzera when you do half a kazayit from one animal, so half a kazayit from one matir, and half a kazayit from another matir, mi ika chatzi matir v'chatzi achila ba'alma deleikum v'ligzor? Is there ever another case in the world where doing half a matir from half an animal, half an eating is really usur? And therefore, it doesn't, there's no real opinion that would make any sense for Rabbi Yehuda Nasi to make a gzera. And says the Gemara, in fact, hachanami mistavro. In fact, this makes a lot of sense that this is the reason of the Rabbanan. The time of the Rabbanan mishum achiyu, that the reason for the Rabbanan is for this exact reason, that the reason the Rabbanan say that you have Isser in the case of, say, Chatzi Matir is because once in a while you don't have two Matirim. And so if you don't have two Matirim, each Matir would make it pigel, right? In a case, say, of a Minchat Chotei, where there's only flour, or the Shlechem Apanim, where there's only spices. And diktani seifa, because if you look at the words of the Mishnah, again, this is the Mishnah later, in 2 days, the Mishnah says, Modim chachamim the Rabbi Meir, the chachamim admit to Rabbi Meir that although usually if you have a machshava about one matir, about either the kmitza or the levona, it's not pigol, they admit b'minchat chotei, they admit by a mincha of a sinner, or minchat kanaot, a mincha of a sota, that in those cases, because there's no spices, shim pigel b'komet shepigel, that if you have a machshava of pigol by just the kmitza, because that's the whole matir, it's pigol, the chayavin alav karet, shakomet hu matir. Now, that's obvious. Pshita. Why do the rabbis have to say that if it's obvious? Mika matir achrina, elalav hachi kamashma. This is what they're explaining to you. The time of the komets mishum deika komets and minchat chotei the damile. That the whole reason that the chachamim say that if you do half a matir, it's not pigol, but you're not allowed to do it, is because of the gezerah of an adjacent and similar case of a kometz of a minchat chotei. And that is the reason why Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah says that it's pasul, even though it's not pigol. And the Chachamim will say later it's pasul by half a matir, even though it's not pigol. But it doesn't really explain why Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would have said that it would be pasul by half a matir and half a eating by the shnei kivsei atzeret. And so that leaves us with a beautiful closure of this discussion. I would just point out we're not done, of course. We're going to keep going in this parak with other details of pigol, of half of a carbon or part of a carbon, and how it impacts the entire carbon.
Whoa.
Okay. Any questions? Clear. Okay. We're up to the Mishnah. Shavua Tov, everyone. Stay safe in the snow. Don't have too much fun.
Yasher Koach.
Thank you all. Have a great week.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.